Mabel, can we stop this? Every night it's something. Can you just show me some respect, some support, like a wife should for her husband?
Respect? Support? Boy, please. You don't deserve any of that. You're worthless, Steve. I could have had a real man.
She wants to know worthless? I'll show her exactly what worthless looks like.
Steve Johnson stood in the kitchen of his modest two-bedroom apartment on the south side of Chicago, holding a plate of spaghetti he had just cooked for dinner. He was 35 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet way about him that made people think he had nothing much going on in his life. That was exactly how he wanted it. "Is this all we're eating again?" Mabel Johnson snapped, walking into the kitchen in her silk robe, arms crossed. She was 30, beautiful, with a sharp tongue that she used like a weapon. "Spaghetti. Again. You know what, Steve? I could have married a real man, a man who could actually provide. Instead, I got you. Worthless." Steve set the plate down slowly on the counter. He didn't flinch. He had heard this 100 times before, maybe more. Every night it was something. The car was too old. The apartment was too small. His job, he told her he worked as a consultant, which was technically true, didn't pay enough. She threw the word worthless at him so often, it had almost stopped hurting. Almost. "I'm doing the best I can, Mabel," he said quietly. "Your best ain't good enough." She rolled her eyes and grabbed her phone off the counter, already scrolling through pictures of some influencer's new car. "My friend Denise's husband just bought her a Range Rover." "A Range Rover, Steve? And you can't even take me to a nice restaurant without checking your bank account first." What Mabel didn't know, what she had never once bothered to find out in the 3 years they'd been married, was that Steve Johnson was worth more than $11 million. Steve had grown up in Englewood, one of the toughest neighborhoods in Chicago, raised by his grandmother after his parents passed when he was 12. He learned early that nobody was going to hand him anything. He worked 2 jobs through community college, transferred to a 4-year university on a partial scholarship, and majored in computer science. By the time he was 26, he had built a small piece of software that helped local businesses manage their inventory. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't flashy, but it worked, and it solved a real problem. He sold that first company for $200,000 when he was 28. Instead of buying a fancy car or a big house like everyone expected, Steve invested almost all of it. He lived simply. He drove a beat-up 2009 Honda Accord. He wore the same 5 shirts on rotation. He kept his money quiet, and he kept his mouth quieter. By the time he met Mabel at a mutual friend's barbecue 2 summers later, Steve was already worth close to $3 million, mostly tied up in investments, real estate, and a second software company he'd started with 2 old college friends. But he never talked about money. He never wore a nice watch. He never let anyone in his personal life know what he was really worth, not even his own wife. "Why do you dress like that?" Mabel had asked him on their 3rd date, eyeing his plain white t-shirt and jeans. "You could clean up nice if you tried." "I like being comfortable," Steve had said, smiling. He should have seen the signs then, but he was in love, or thought he was, and Mabel was charming when she wanted to be. She laughed loud, she danced well, and in those early days, she made him feel like the only man in the room. It took getting married for the mask to slip. It started small, a comment here, a comment there. "You should dress better if you want a promotion." Then it grew bigger. "My cousin's husband makes 6 figures. What do you make again?" Then it turned cruel. "You're lucky I even stayed with a man like you." And finally, the word she loved most, worthless. Steve absorbed it all, quietly building his empire behind her back. His software company had grown into something serious, a logistics platform used by mid-sized businesses across the Midwest. He'd also quietly bought 2 rental properties in Bronzeville and 1 in Hyde Park, all cash, all under a business name Mabel had never heard of. His net worth, as of the last quarter, sat at $11.2 million. He kept a plain-looking checking account for household bills, grocery money, rent, the utilities. All modest, all boring, exactly the kind of numbers that made Mabel roll her eyes every time she peeked at his phone banking app. What she never found, because she never looked hard enough, and because Steve made sure of it, were the three other accounts, the trust, and the LLC that held everything else. His best friend, Marcus, had asked him more than once, "Why don't you just tell her, man? Let her see who she married. Because if I tell her, she'll change how she treats me," Steve had said one night over drinks at a bar on 47th Street. "And I don't want her to love the money. I want to know if she ever loved me." By the time Steve turned 35, he had his answer. She didn't. The final straw came on a Tuesday evening in October. Steve had just gotten home from a meeting with his lawyer, Andre Bell, a sharp, no-nonsense man in his 40s who had handled Steve's business dealings for the past 6 years. Andre was more than a lawyer to Steve. He was one of the few people who knew the full truth about his finances, and one of the only people Steve trusted completely. Steve walked in the door tired, his tie loosened, his mind on a new deal he was closing for one of his properties. Mabel was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, a glass of wine in her hand. "Where were you?" she asked without looking up. "Handling some business," Steve said. "Business?" she scoffed, finally looking at him with that familiar sneer. "You don't have business, Steve. You have a little computer job that barely pays the bills. Stop acting like you're somebody." Steve stood there for a moment. Something in him, some final wall that had held steady for 3 years, cracked just slightly. "Mabel, why do you talk to me like this?" "Because it's true," she snapped, standing up now, wine sloshing in her glass. "I married beneath myself, Steve. I could have had anybody. My mama told me not to marry a man with no ambition, and here I am, stuck with you. Worthless. That's what you are. Worthless." There it was again. That word. Steve didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply nodded slowly, turned around, and walked into the bedroom. He picked up his phone and sent a text to Andre. "It's time. Come by Friday evening. Bring everything." Andre replied within a minute. "You sure about this, Steve?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Steve typed back. Friday evening came fast. Steve told Mabel that his lawyer was stopping by to discuss some paperwork, which wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. Mabel, as usual, barely looked up from her phone when he mentioned it. "Lawyer for what? You getting sued or something?" she asked, half laughing, clearly enjoying the idea that her husband might be in some kind of financial trouble. "Something like that," Steve said, hiding a small smile. At exactly 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Steve opened the door to find Andre Bell standing there in a crisp charcoal suit, holding a leather briefcase. Andre had a presence about him, calm, confident, the kind of man who commanded a room without raising his voice. "Evening, Steve," Andre said, shaking his hand firmly. "Thanks for coming, Andre. Come on in." Mabel appeared in the living room doorway, wine glass in hand as always, eyeing Andre up and down. She straightened her posture slightly, the way people do when they realize someone important has walked into the room, even if they don't yet know why. "Mabel, this is my lawyer, Andre Bell," Steve said. "Andre, this is my wife, Mabel." "Pleasure to meet you," Andre said smoothly, shaking her hand. "Likewise," Mabel said, a little confused but trying to play it cool. "So what kind of paperwork are we talking about? Steve been getting himself into trouble?" Andre glanced at Steve, who gave a small nod. Andre set his briefcase down on the coffee table and opened it, pulling out a thick folder. "Actually, Mrs. Johnson, I'm here because Steve asked me to walk you both through something important. Some financial matters regarding your husband's estate. Mabel let out a short laugh, sitting down on the arm of the couch. Estate? Steve doesn't have an estate. Steve barely has a savings account. She looked at Steve with that same tired, mocking expression. Right, baby? Tell your lawyer the truth. We're broke. Steve said nothing. He simply gestured toward Andre. Andre cleared his throat and opened the folder. Mrs. Johnson, I've been Steve's attorney for 6 years. In that time, I've helped him structure and manage a personal net worth that currently stands at approximately $11.2 million. The room went completely silent. Mabel blinked. I'm sorry, what did you say? $11.2 million. Andre repeated calmly. That includes his stake in Johnson Logistics Solutions, 3 rental properties in Chicago, a diversified investment portfolio, and a trust fund set up under his name only. Mabel's wine glass slipped slightly in her hand. She set it down on the coffee table, her mouth hanging open. That's not possible. Steve, is this some kind of joke? Is this some kind of sick joke you two are playing on me? It's not a joke, Mabel, Steve said, finally speaking, his voice steady and calm. Every word of it is true. But you drive a Honda. You wear the same 5 shirts. You act like we can't afford a nice dinner out. Mabel's voice cracked with disbelief, her hands shaking now. I do all of that because I like living simple, Steve said. I built everything I have from nothing, Mabel. Nobody gave me a dime. I grew up with nothing in Englewood, and I worked for every cent of what I have. I never flaunted it, because I wanted to see who loved me for me, not for my money. Mabel's face went through several emotions in the span of a few seconds. Shock, disbelief, and then something that looked a lot like calculation. Steve watched it happen and felt something in his chest go cold. Even now, even in this moment, she was doing math. Well, Mabel said, straightening up, trying to smooth over the last few minutes. Well, this changes things, doesn't it? I mean, baby, if you had told me sooner, we wouldn't have had all these little arguments. We could have, Mabel, Steve interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. For 3 years, you have called me worthless. You told me I wasn't a real man. You told your friends I couldn't provide. You compared me to every other man's husband and made me feel small in my own home. And this whole time, I had over $11 million sitting in accounts you never once cared to ask about, because you never once believed I was capable of building anything. Steve, baby, I didn't mean any of that. You know how I get when I'm stressed. You meant every word, Steve said. And that's why Andre is here tonight. Andre pulled another set of papers from his briefcase and set them gently on the coffee table. Mrs. Johnson, Andre said, I should also inform you that 6 months ago, Steve had me draft a postnuptial agreement, along with updates to his trust and estate documents. All of his assets, the company, the properties, the investment accounts, are protected under a trust that predates your marriage and has never included your name as a beneficiary. Mabel's face went pale. A postnup? Steve, when did you— 6 months ago, Steve said. After the night you told your sister on the phone, right in front of me, that you were only staying married to me because divorce was expensive. Do you remember saying that, Mabel? Mabel's mouth opened, but no words came out. I remember, Steve said softly. I remember every single thing you've said to me these past 3 years. And that night, I decided I needed to protect what I built, because clearly, you never saw a future with me. You saw a future with my bank account, whenever you finally found out about it. Andre continued laying out the documents, calmly and professionally, as if this were any other business meeting. He explained that under Illinois law, and per the terms of the postnuptial agreement, Mabel herself had unknowingly signed 6 months prior, believing it was simply an update to their renter's insurance and household paperwork, something Steve had asked her to sign quickly one busy evening. She would not be entitled to any of Steve's business assets, properties, or trust funds in the event of a divorce. "You tricked me into signing something," Mabel said, her voice rising, anger replacing shock now. "I asked you to sign paperwork," Steve said calmly. "You didn't read it. You never read anything I asked you to sign, Mabel, because you've never respected me enough to think it mattered. You signed it in under a minute while watching your reality show." Mabel stood up now, pacing the living room, her hands running through her hair. "This is insane. This is absolutely insane. $11 million. And you had me thinking we were struggling? Do you know how humiliating this is? Now you know how I felt," Steve said quietly. "Every single night, you called me worthless in front of your friends, your family, even strangers at restaurants. Now you know how it feels to be humiliated by someone who's supposed to love you." Mabel turned to Andre, desperation creeping into her voice. "Surely there's something I'm entitled to. We've been married 3 years. That has to count for something legally." Andre glanced at Steve, who nodded for him to continue. "Under the terms of the agreement," Andre said, "Mrs. Johnson is entitled to the personal belongings acquired during the marriage. Any joint bank accounts used strictly for household expenses, which currently total around $4,000, and, per Illinois state guidelines, a modest transitional spousal support for a period not exceeding 6 months, given the short length of the marriage." $4,000, Mabel repeated, her voice hollow. 6 months of some small support payment? That's it? After everything? "That's it," Steve said. Mabel sank back down onto the couch, staring at the papers on the coffee table like they were written in a language she didn't understand. For the first time since Steve had met her, she looked genuinely small. "Steve, please," she said, her voice softening, shifting into something more pleading. "We can work through this. I know I said some things I shouldn't have, but marriages go through rough patches. We can go to counseling. We can start over. I love you." Steve looked at her for a long moment. 3 years of memories flashed behind his eyes. The wedding day when she'd smiled at him like he hung the moon. The early dinners when she'd laughed at his jokes. And then all the nights after, filled with insults and comparisons, and that word she loved to throw at him like a knife. "Mabel," he said finally, "I asked you 100 times over the past year if you were happy with me. Every single time, you found a way to remind me I wasn't good enough. You never once asked if I was happy. You never once wondered if maybe I was carrying something you didn't understand. You just assumed I was worthless, and you treated me accordingly. I didn't know." "That's exactly the point," Steve said, his voice rising slightly for the first time all evening. "You didn't know because you never cared to know. A wife who loves her husband asks questions. She wonders about his day, his dreams, his struggles. You never asked me a single question about my work in 3 years, Mabel. Not one. You just assumed, and you judged, and you insulted." The room fell quiet again. Andre began gathering the papers back into his briefcase, giving the couple a moment, though everyone in the room understood exactly where this was heading. "So that's it then," Mabel said, her voice flat now, drained of its usual fire. "You're divorcing me." "I already filed the papers 2 weeks ago," Steve said. "Andre's just here tonight to make sure everything is clear, and so you understand exactly what you're entitled to and what you're not." Mabel looked up sharply. 2 weeks ago? You've been planning this for 2 weeks? "I've been planning this for 6 months, Steve corrected. "Ever since the postnup, I just needed to make sure everything was in place first." The days that followed were quiet in the Johnson household, quieter than they'd ever been. Mabel moved out 3 weeks later, into a small 1-bedroom apartment near her sister's place in Chatham. She took her clothes, her jewelry, and the $4,000 from the joint account, along with 6 months of modest support payments that barely covered her new, much smaller rent. Word got around the way it always does. Denise, the same friend whose husband had bought her the Range Rover, called Mabel within days, her voice dripping with the kind of fake sympathy that barely hides real curiosity. "Girl, I heard Steve was rich this whole time," Denise said. $11 million? And you're telling me you didn't know?" "I didn't know," Mabel admitted quietly, sitting alone in her new apartment, surrounded by boxes she hadn't fully unpacked. "How did you not know? Y'all were married." Mabel didn't have a good answer. The truth was, she never asked, because she'd already decided Steve wasn't worth asking about. She'd married a man she thought she was better than, and she'd spent 3 years making sure he knew it. She never once considered that the quiet man cooking spaghetti in their kitchen might be building something bigger than anything she could have imagined. Steve, meanwhile, kept living his life exactly the way he always had. He still drove the same Honda Accord, though Marcus finally convinced him to trade it in for a slightly newer used model a few months later. He still wore his same rotation of plain shirts. He still worked quietly, expanding Johnson Logistics Solutions into 2 new states, closing deals on 2 more rental properties in Chicago, and mentoring a group of teenagers from Englewood through a nonprofit he'd quietly funded for years, one Mabel had never even known existed. "You ever regret not telling her sooner?" Marcus asked him one evening, the two of them sitting on Steve's back porch with 2 beers, watching the Chicago skyline glow in the distance. "Not for a second," Steve said. "If I'd told her on day 1, I'd have spent 3 years wondering if she loved me or my money. At least now, I know the truth. It just cost me 3 years and a broken marriage to find it out." "Small price," Marcus said, raising his beer. "Small price," Steve agreed, clinking his bottle against his friend's. A year later, Steve met someone new, a schoolteacher named Renee, whom he met at the same nonprofit where he mentored kids from his old neighborhood. She had no idea about his money for the first 4 months they dated, and when she finally found out, quite by accident, from a mutual friend, her first reaction wasn't excitement or calculation. It was concern. "Why didn't you tell me?" Renee asked, sitting across from him at a small diner on 63rd Street. "Were you scared I'd treat you differently?" "Something like that," Steve admitted. "Steve," Renee said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I liked you when I thought you were a guy who drove a beat-up Honda and volunteered every weekend, teaching kids how to code. That's who I fell for. The money doesn't change that. If anything, it just tells me you're smart, on top of being kind." Steve smiled, really smiled, for the first time in a long while. Mabel, for her part, eventually moved on too, though the story of her marriage to a secretly wealthy man became something of a cautionary tale among her friends. Denise told the story at every gathering, half mocking, half in disbelief, and Mabel had to sit and listen to it, retold over and over, a reminder of the 3 years she'd spent tearing down a man who never once deserved it. She thought about reaching out to Steve sometimes, thought about apologizing properly, explaining herself, maybe even asking if there was any chance left between them. But she never did, because deep down, she knew the truth. Steve hadn't just found out he was rich. He'd always been rich, in money and in patience, and she'd spent 3 years treating both like they were worthless. The word she'd thrown at him so many times had finally landed somewhere else entirely, on her own regrets, sitting quietly in a small apartment in Chatham, while Steve Johnson kept building, kept growing, and kept living exactly the life he'd always wanted, just without her in it. In the end, Steve never gave Mabel a dime beyond what the law required, and he never looked back with anger. He simply moved forward, the same quiet, steady man he'd always been, proving that sometimes the richest people are the ones who never feel the need to prove it to anybody at all, until the day they finally do.